Hi, welcome to Agent Edge, writing offers like a pro. Let's be clear, this training isn't about filling out all 10 pages of the RPA line by line. If that's what you're looking for, though, simply head over to the Buyer Disclosures 101 section because we have you covered there. This session is laser focused on what really matters when you're writing an offer: first impressions. Because let's face it, your RPA is your buyer's handshake. It's the first thing a listing agent sees. If it's sloppy, vague, or full of red flags, your client's chances drop immediately. But when it's clean, precise, and strategic, you build instant trust and momentum. So here's what we're going to cover: what questions to ask before writing, how to avoid top contract killing mistakes, the must-know numbers behind a clean offer, and how to use Section 30 like a pro. So let's get into it and let's write offers that win. Hello. Okay, let's jump into writing offers like a pro. Now, this training is going to highlight certain things to avoid when writing a contract and what questions you need to know to answer. If you want to look at the entirety of the residential purchase agreement and each page and how to fill out each page, you're going to want to visit Buyer Disclosures 101. All right, so let's get started. Welcome to this training. This training is going to teach you how to write strong, clean, and compliant offers using the Nevada Residential Purchase Agreement. Who is this for? Well, this is for new or newer agents or even seasoned agents who need some extra repetition practice to build confidence in contract writing. So here's what we're going to learn today: understanding key parts of the RPA, what questions to ask before writing the RPA, how to write clean, strong, math-correct offers, and how to avoid common contract-killing mistakes, and how to use contingencies to protect your buyer. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, your offer is your buyer's first impression. So sloppy contracts can easily scare sellers and the listing agent. This also helps us build trust, especially with the listing agent. You want to look professional, and it's legal protection. I want you to treat this RPA as the legal document it is. It protects your client, but also your reputation. So here's some questions to ask before you even start writing or drafting up the offer. Most of these questions are going to actually come from the buyer's lender. So when we talk about financing, we first need to understand what loan type our buyer wants and what price range we are working in. A buyer may want a conventional loan, but after talking to the lender, you may discover they're actually only qualified for an FHA loan. We want to understand how much they can put down for their down payment and also the earnest money deposit. Now, we're going to talk about the difference between those two in just a bit. Credits and timeline. We need to find out from the lender if your buyer needs a certain amount of seller credit, also known as seller concessions, from the seller in order for the buyer to afford this property. So for example, if we're going to write an offer at $600,000, my lender may say, you can write a $600,000 offer only if the seller gives the buyer $10,000 in closing cost. And what's a preferred move-in timeline? Your buyer may want a 14-day close, but we need to confirm with the lender that the lender can actually move that quickly to get us to the finish line within those 14 days. Contingencies in closing. Can the buyer waive or shorten any contingencies? So if we are in a competitive market and we need to shorten our contingencies to make our buyer's offer stand out, we want to make sure the lender can follow through those timelines. So instead of a 20-day appraisal, you don't want to just randomly put 10 days without verifying with the lender that they can actually do the appraisal process within 10 days. And is this buyer strong enough to close in 21 days? So let's say our seller needs a quick close and your buyer's ready to do that. We need to make sure the lender can as well. Okay. So one of the most important pages of the RPA is page 1. And unfortunately, this is where we often see some mistakes. So we're going to go line by line here on page 1. One of the first things I want to highlight, over here in the top right section, you'll see date. You won't believe how many times agents forget to put the date that they're writing this offer. So make sure you select that part. Then if we go over here to line 7, it's asking if the buyer intends to occupy this house as a permanent residence. We also see these boxes sometimes unchecked, so make sure you check if your buyer intends to occupy this property as their personal residence. Okay, now let's go to the financing terms and conditions section. 1A is talking about the earnest money deposit. The earnest money deposit usually is dictated on the MLS sheet set by the seller and the listing agent. Just like everything in real estate, that number is negotiable. But let's assume they're putting on the MLS sheet that there's a $5,000 EMD. Okay, we can tell our buyer that up front. If you choose to move forward with writing an offer on this house, we are going to need to wire $5,000 up front to the escrow company. This essentially is a good faith deposit. Now here's where it can get confusing. We usually want to take this out of their full down payment amount. So if someone comes to you and says they only have $20,000 total for a down payment, we're going to extract that $5,000 up front, wire it as the earnest money deposit, leaving $15,000 left for the rest of the down payment. That $5,000 goes right back to your buyer at close of escrow, making their full down payment amount back at the $20,000. Okay, so 1B, additional deposit. This is optional. It's very rare you're going to use this line item. But additional deposit could be something like we give the $5,000 earnest money deposit, EMD, up front. But maybe our buyers are in a very competitive market, so they tell the sellers, once we get through our due diligence period, we are willing to give another $5,000 deposit. So that's an example of how you can use 1B. Now we go to 1C, the loan amount. This is the amount of money that the lender is going to loan your buyer in order to purchase this house. So we need to put that dollar amount there. Then we need to select if it's a conventional, FHA, VA, or other specific loan. Then we go to 1D, assumption of loan. This is very rare that you're going to use this, but this is if they're going to assume an existing loan on the house. Then we go over to 1E, promissory note. Also very rare that you're going to use this, but this is where a buyer will execute a promissory note to secure a deed. Then we go to 1F, remaining amount of the down payment. So this is where we would put that $15,000. So remember I mentioned, for example, if your buyer's putting $20,000 down payment, we're taking $5,000 up front for the good faith deposit, also known as an EMD, and the remaining down payment's going to be that $15,000. So in total, $20,000. And then 1G is the total purchase price. So after you fill all these out, you want to triple check that your math adds up. This is the first thing that listing agents will look for. So you're going to add A, you're going to add B, you're going to add F, and all of those should equal what the total purchase price is listed on line G. So here's an example of all this filled out. So we have a purchase price of $620,000. So one of the first things I do is fill out line G, because I know that's the total amount that I need to make sure everything else equals to. Okay. So line G, I have my $620,000. Now I know my down payment, based on my conversation with the buyer and the lender, is going to be 10% of $620,000, which is $62,000. So when we look at line F, you'll see I put $52,000, because in this scenario, the EMD is $10,000. So remember, we extract the EMD from the total down payment amount, and now that $10,000 is up on line A. And then when you subtract all of that and your math, it comes out to the leftover balance for their loan, which is $558,000. So you can work backwards into filling out these numbers. And then when I go back and add my $10,000, $558,000, and $52,000, I now come to a grand total of the purchase price of $620,000. All right, so here's an overview of contingency dates and timelines. Now, these are, I don't want to say traditional, but these are a good amount of days to start with when you're writing offers. Now, depending on the market, you may extend these or shorten them, depending on if you're in a buyer's market or a seller's market. But it's not uncommon for a due diligence period to be 10 days. And as a reminder, due diligence period is the amount of days you have to do any type of home inspection on the house. This usually is the first contingency that starts in your escrow process. Okay? And another little pro tip, whatever date you have a fully executed contract, meaning both parties, the buyer and the seller, have signed off agreeing to this contract, day one of your contingency start the following day. So if I send an offer to a listing agent on behalf of my buyer today, my buyer signs it, I send it to the listing agent sends it to the seller signs off and says, yes, we accept this offer. Day one of my due diligence starts tomorrow. Okay. Then we have our appraisal contingency. This is usually anywhere between 15 and 21 days. Again, you always want to double check with the lender to make sure they can actually get this entire process completed within those 15 to 21 days. Then you have your longest contingency, which will be your loan contingency. I personally like to put this as long as the entirety of the escrow period. So if I have a 30-day escrow, I like my loan to be 30 days. This gives an extra layer of protection for my buyer should the loan fall out for whatever reason. Okay, and just a reminder, shorter timelines and contingency equals stronger offers in this stronger offer in the seller's eyes. All right. Another section I want to go over is page 9, section 30. This is the additional terms section in the residential purchase agreement. We can essentially put any additional negotiations in this section, but I want you to make sure your language is clear, concise, and legal binding. Okay? So here are some examples of what you could put in additional terms. If your buyer wants to do an appraisal gap coverage, you would want to write something like, if appraisal comes in low, buyer agrees to pay up to $10,000 above appraised value, not to exceed purchase price. Now, something like this is used to make your offer more competitive in a low appraisal market. You can also do something like an earnest money deposit early release. Buyer agrees that the EMD shall be released to the seller upon completion of due diligence, provided buyer has not canceled in writing. Now, something like this shows commitment and can help you stand out in a multiple offer situation. You can put something like post-possession agreement. Seller may remain in the home for up to 3 days post-close at no cost to the buyer. Post-possession addendum to be attached. You would use something like this. It's common when sellers need to move after closing. Okay. These are just some examples. I recently put something in there along the lines of seller to remove all 20 butterfly decals on windows prior to close of escrow. Okay, so if there's anything additional your buyers want to make sure happens before close of escrow, this is the section you'll put it on. Just make sure your language is clear, concise, and legal binding. All right, and here's some common mistakes to avoid that I want you to look out for. Not checking the occupancy box. We talked about that on page 1. We want to make sure we identify if your buyer intends to occupy this property as a permanent residence. If you forget this, we don't have a completed RPA. Okay. Forgetting to add seller credits in section 9D. You don't want to be in a situation where you write an offer and your buyer's assuming the seller is giving them $9,000, but you forgot to put that in the contract. So that's going to go in section 9D. Leaving blanks instead of 0, NA, or a strike through. Now, I have a small background in legal paperwork, so I know not to leave anything blank in a contract. So, for example, on page 1, if there is no additional deposit, I'm not going to leave that blank. I'm going to put the number 0 in there. And if there's any other blanks in your contract that don't have a dollar amount, you want to put something like NA on there. Here's some more common mistakes to avoid. Incorrect contingency timelines. So there I have close of escrow and I have a date in there. And what I mean by incorrect contingency timelines, I don't want a certain date of close of escrow, but my appraisal inspection or my appraisal contingency to be longer than my close of escrow date. That doesn't make sense. So you want to make sure everything is adding up correctly. Forgetting to check off disclosures. So on section 12, you are going to select which disclosures you need the seller to give your buyer once you go under contract. You always want to select the seller's real property disclosure form, construction defect claims disclosure, the hey, it's a smart home disclosure, and I always add in other and put in mold waiver. If I don't put in mold waiver in this section, the seller is not obligated to give me the mold waiver, and that's an important form for me, my brokerage, and my buyers. Leaving the date blank on page 1, we also went over that in the beginning of this training. Up on the top right, you want to make sure you're actually putting the date you're writing this contract. All right, so I want you to download at the end of this training a blank residential purchase agreement. And I want you to practice writing out page 1 and also the additional terms. And I want you to practice the additional terms because I want you to get comfortable with how to expand the writing on this to make sure it is clear and concise. But here's a scenario I want you to practice. You have a buyer and they're purchasing a house at the purchase price of $450,000, and they're going to do an FHA loan. They're only doing 3.5% down, so it's going to be 3.5% down of the actual purchase price, and the earnest money deposit's going to be $7,500. And there's also going to be a 2-day post-possession. So that 2-day post-possession, I want you to come up with some good language you can put under additional terms. All right, and here's some smart phrases to use with clients. Hey, let's make sure your offer is clean, but still protects you. I'll double check your loan terms with your lender before submitting this offer. We can be aggressive on price if we keep the timelines tidy. And I'll make sure your EMD is credited towards your down payment. All right, so here's the final takeaway on this, how to write offers like a pro quick training class. Write offers with clarity, confidence, and class. Every line in that contract represents you and your buyer. You are their best shot at getting the deal and keeping it. So show up like a pro every time. Let's wrap this up. A strong offer doesn't just get accepted. It makes your buyer feel secure, your reputation look polished, and the listing agent trusts that they're working with a pro. So remember, always double check your math, be clear in section 30, ask the right questions before you write, and never leave blanks because every detail matters. Your homework. Pick an active MLS listing and draft a mock RPA offer based on what you've learned. Bring it to your growth advisor for review and feedback. You've got the tools. Now go use them to win the deal, and I'll see you in the next session.